Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Karen Gray's Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're continuing with our look at different film reviews, and in particular, we're going to continue with our look at different Disney films. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at The Song of the South from 1946. Now, it's a very controversial film, and we're going to talk about all the different nuances of that. So definitely stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, don't forget obviously to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. You know, about 3/4 of you have not subscribed, and yeah, it would really help out the channel if you did. So yeah, now is your opportunity to do that. And also as well, even if you are subscribed, don't forget to go and hit the bell button so you stay notified whenever we have new videos out. So yeah, without further ado, let's kind of dive in. But before actually we dive in, don't forget that how we set up these kind of like videos, you know, if you've seen our videos already, then you would know how it's kind of set us up. If you've not seen them already, don't know what you've been doing with your time. But for those who are new to this, right? So we have 6 different categories, right? So we have the story of the story, we have the story of the creator, the story of the studio, the themes and the history, the legacy, and we have any notable lines and notable effects within the film. So that's what we're going to be discussing when we're talking about this. So without further ado, let's dive straight into the story of the story. So now I'll talk about the story of the story. So the story of The Song of the South is based on a collection of different stories, yeah, under the title of Uncle Remus, right? So Uncle Remus was a fictional character, and the different stories that were told like by this fictional character were compiled by Joel Chandler Harris, right? So we'll talk about him a little bit later on. But for now, just understand that, like, yeah, so he collected these different stories from different African Americans, and the legacy of it goes all the way back to West Africa and stuff. Yeah, we'll talk about that in more detail later. But without further ado, let's dive straight into the plot of the film, right? So you've got a 7-year-old Johnny, and he's on vacation with his family, and they're going to visit his grandmother's plantation in Georgia. Now, I just want to make the point of this that they are not slaves. Like, the black people that you see in this are not slaves, as this is based in the Reconstruction era. So this is post-Civil War, this is post-slavery days. So all the black people that you see are freedmen, they're sharecroppers, they are not slaves, okay? I just want to make that point very clear. But anyway, so the dad, he is a controversial newspaperman. We don't really know what the controversy is that he's kind of like writing in these newspapers. But anyway, it's the thing where he ends up dropping the family off to the grandmother's, and then he has to go back to Atlanta. And obviously Johnny himself is very upset with this, and his mother tries to console him, but isn't able to, right? And it's the thing where Johnny's father has told Johnny over the years about like all the different stories regarding Uncle Remus. So Uncle Remus for Johnny is very much a kind of like a legend of a character, right? He's kind of a mythical character, and so he's like, yo, is Uncle Remus real? You know, really want to like meet him and like hear his stories firsthand. But of course, he's very upset by the departure of his father, and so he ends up packing his bags and ends up deciding that he's going to go to Atlanta, yeah, to see his father. So as he's leaving, he ends up stumbling across Uncle Remus, telling some stories to some children. And Uncle Remus kind of like realizes that he's there out the corner of his eye, but he doesn't make a big fuss about it. So all the other people who are on the plantation are all like looking like everywhere, being like, where's Johnny, right? And he says, don't worry, Johnny's with me. And they're like, well, we don't see him anywhere. But he said, don't worry about it, I'll sort it out, right? So anyway, Uncle Remus ends up welcoming Johnny into his cabin, and Johnny explains to him that he's going to go and walk all the way to Atlanta. So Uncle Remus says, sure, okay, fine, if that's what you really want to do, we'll walk to Atlanta. Yes, I'll make some food, we'll go, right? However, before he does this, he says, well, I need to tell you like a little story about Brer Rabbit. So this is the first story that we have out of 3, right? So this is the story of Brer Rabbit earns $1 a minute. So the plot of this story, yeah, is that Brer Rabbit, he wants to leave his home, and eventually he ends up being caught by a Brer Fox in a trap, right? So the way that he gets out of the trap is by tricking Brer Bear by saying, look, you know, it's not a trap, like kind of like he's up there and he's basically scaring away scarecrows, and he's getting paid $1 a minute, right? And obviously back in those days, or even nowadays, $1 a minute is a lot of money, right? So Brer Bear, who's quite a kind of silly and like gullible like character, he gets sucked into that. So basically they end up swapping themselves, right? So Brer Rabbit ends up going free and Brer Bear ends up in the trap. So when Brer Fox finally gets there, he's like, what the hell? Like, kind of, you're an idiot. Like, kind of, how have you allowed yourself to get trapped like this, right? So that's the plot of the first little story which has been told in that. So the moral of the story is basically that you can't run away from your problems, right? Because your problems are going to end up finding you. So Uncle Remus obviously told this story for a reason, right? But he pretends that, like, that they're still going on this journey. But Johnny, after thinking about the story, has been like, you know what, actually, yeah, I can't run away from my problems and stuff. I better just stay here on the plantation. And Uncle Remus ends up taking Johnny back to his mother and grandma, and they're very relieved that he's there. But the mum is a little bit hesitant about, because it's way past the bedtime and stuff. And this is a recurring theme that we see throughout the film. The mum is just a bit kind of hostile to Uncle Remus telling all these stories. So anyway, it goes to the next day, and it's a thing where Johnny has made friends with Toby, who's a young black boy who's on the plantation. And then he also goes off and makes friends with Ginny, right? So Ginny is a poor white girl and stuff from like a very poor family, kind of like outside like the plantation and stuff. And it's a thing where Ginny has two older brothers, right? And these older brothers are like really horrible to her and also just to everyone in general. And it's a thing where she has a puppy, and they say that they're going to drown the puppy. So in order to save the puppy, Ginny gives the puppy to Johnny. But it's a thing where Ginny's brothers are very upset with this, and they don't want him to have the puppy and stuff. So what Johnny does is he says that he's going to take it home. However, his mum says, you're not allowed to have the puppy, right? You've got to get rid of it. So Johnny then goes to Uncle Remus and basically persuades him to look after the dog, right? And unbeknownst to Uncle Remus, the mum has said, you can't have the dog. So Uncle Remus agrees to take care of the puppy, but as he does, he ends up telling the story of Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby. So this is where Brer Rabbit ends up kicking a tar baby. This is basically just a person kind of made out of tar and stuff. And it's a thing where it's actually a trap that Brer Fox has laid for him, right? So Brer Rabbit ends up like punching the thing, ends up getting himself trapped. And then it's a thing where it looks like it's going to be the end for Brer Rabbit finally. But what he does is he ends up doing a bit of reverse psychology, and he ends up tricking Brer Fox into saying, whatever you do, please don't throw me into the briar patch, right? Please, whatever you do, don't throw me in that. And obviously, Brer Fox end up doing that. And obviously, Brer Rabbit, he's a rabbit, so you throw him in a bunch of like nettles and stuff, he's not going to affect him, right? So he ends up running free. So the moral of that story is basically do a bit of reverse psychology on people, right? So, and that's how you kind of get one over on them. So when Johnny next comes across the brothers, yeah, he says, please, whatever you do, please don't go and tell your mum about the puppy, right? And obviously they go and tell the mum about the puppy, and they end up getting beaten. And they end up obviously being annoyed at this. And when they figure out that they've been tricked by Johnny, they, in terms of like trying to get revenge, then go to his mum and say what's happened. So this is where the mum goes to Uncle Remus and says, all right, I've said that he shouldn't be having this puppy, and I'm telling you now, please, can you stay away from my son and stop telling him these stories and stuff, right? Because it's going against my wishes. So Uncle Remus, he agrees to this. He's sad, but he agrees to this. And it's a thing where the next day ends up being Johnny's birthday party, right? And it's a thing where Ginny ends up being invited, So the mum is a bit hesitant about her coming because like she's from a lower class, but the grandma's like, no, she can come. Of course she can come. So Johnny is, he's going about with Ginny and stuff. She's got a lovely new dress. But out of spite, it's a thing where her older brothers end up basically making it very dirty. So Ginny now is really upset. She's all crying and everything. And it's a thing where Uncle Remus, to try and cheer her up, tells the story of Brer Rabbit and the Laughing Place. So the story with Brer Rabbit and the Laughing Place, right, is as follows. It's a thing where Brer Rabbit has really been trapped by Brer Fox and by Brer Bear at this point. Like, it looks like Brer Fox is going to skin him alive and eat him. But it's a thing where Brer Rabbit tricks Brer Bear into saying, if you let me live, I can take you to my laughing place. You wouldn't want to eat me before I've taken you to my laughing place, because then you won't experience the laughing place. So Brer Bear, in spite of what Brer Fox is saying, he allows Brer Rabbit to take him to this laughing place. So we go to the laughing place. Brer Bear sticks his nose into it, and it turns out that it is a beehive, right? So it's a thing where they're all kind of getting stung up by these bees, and Brer Bear's like, how is this a laughing place, yeah? And Brer Rabbit says, it's not your laughing place, it's my laughing place, right? So that story there cheers up Ginny. However, it's a thing where, just like her brothers, she's kind of a snitch, yeah? At least she's an unintentional snitch, but she's still a snitch. So when they end up going back to the big house and stuff, and Miss Sally, who's like the mother and stuff, yeah, like kind of asks Johnny, where you been? Like, kind of, it's your birthday, you haven't been, where are you at, right? It's a thing where Ginny tells her, oh, we were just with Uncle Remus and he was telling us stories. To which obviously Miss Sally gets really annoyed by this, yeah, and says to Remus, look, I've told you for the last time, yeah, you need to actually stay away from my son now. Actually stay away, because like you've really gone against my wishes, yeah. I'm ordering you to like stay away from him. So Uncle Remus, obviously, like we said, he's a freed man. So he goes, okay, fair enough, cool. So he packs his things and he's going to go and leave the plantation and go to Atlanta. But as he's on his way, Johnny is obviously really distraught by this, yeah? So he chases after Uncle Remus. And there's a thing where a little bit earlier, there was a bit of foreshadowing, because there's a bull which is in one of the pens. And Toby warns Johnny, don't run into this pen, yeah, because the bull will hit you, right? So in this kind of distraught state, Johnny forgets this and he ends up running into the pen, and lo and behold, the ball ends up hitting him. So it looks as if Johnny might end up being dead at this point, yeah, right? So everyone's all gathered round and stuff. Everyone's, kind of praying for him and like hoping that like he gets better. But Uncle Remus comes and tells him a story, and miraculously he ends up coming back to health. And it's a thing where Miss Sally, after seeing this, kind of goes, actually, you know what, Uncle Remus, you can stay, you can keep telling him the stories, right? I forgive you and stuff, right? And also as well, it's a thing where the dad comes back, and yeah, basically the story ends all happily ever after. And the final little bit is a thing where they're all skipping about. Uncle Remus is there as well, and lo and behold, Brer Rabbit, who up until this point has been kind of a fictional character, he comes to life, and all the other little critters, yeah, they also come to life as well, and they all walk off into the sunset together, and the film ends happily ever after. So that's the plot of Song of the South. So if you haven't seen it before, now you've kind of basically got the gist of it. So spoiler alert, but meh, that is what it is. So now we've kind of spoken about the story of the story. Now we're going to talk about the story of the creator. So Joel Chandler Harris, he compiled the stories of Uncle Remus, and he did this in 1881. And it's a thing where during this era, as we've spoken about in previous videos, we're going to talk about the Reconstruction era. He was a Reconstructionist, right? So he was very sympathetic towards the plight of like black people and stuff. And so he wrote these stories down as a way of like letting the rest of the country know about the struggles of African Americans, right? So how he got these stories was between the ages of 14 and 18, he lived on a Georgia plantation, yeah? So this is from 1862 to 1866. This is during the Civil War and a little bit afterwards, yeah, during the period of like, emancipation, right? So he was on the plantation, and he used to go and listen to the stories of the African-American slaves and getting all these different things, right? So the stories of Brer Rabbit, the stories of Uncle Remus, etc., what these are essentially are basically kind of amalgamation of different West African traditions. So in West Africa, historically, you had different oral traditions, right? And this is how people would pass stories down, because obviously it's kind of in the days before like they had access to writing. So you'd have someone in the village, yeah, called a griot or a jelly, depending on like where like in Africa it was. So this person would be tasked with basically telling the stories of like, different things, right? So obviously in West Africa, you don't have like rabbits and bears and foxes and stuff, right? But the point is that the kind of archetypal like kind of characters, yeah, in terms of there being a kind of trickster hero, right? You tend to see this quite a lot of in West African culture. So for instance, the stories about Anansi, which are stories which are often spoken about in Jamaica and stuff, right? Anansi the spider, again, is this kind of, it's linked in with this kind of archetypal thing of like a trickster hero. So that ends up in an American context being translated, yeah, by the slaves into here's a fox, here's a rabbit, here's a bear and stuff, right? So all of that kind of explains where these stories came from, and it's a thing where Harris, he ended up being, very, very popular and stuff, right? So much so that within his lifetime, he ended up at a later point being invited to the White House by Teddy Roosevelt. Now, we've spoken about him in previous videos as well. He's very, very progressive for his time, especially on the issue of race. And it's a thing where what he even said, yeah, with regard to Harris, yeah, was this: presidents come and presidents go, but Uncle Remus stays put. So that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of just how influential these stories were in America at the time. So now talk about how these stories end up being put into the context of becoming a Disney film is a thing where Walt Disney, from as early as 1938, basically bought the rights for this. Yeah, so he went to the Harris household and basically, like spoke to his family, and he managed to buy the book for $10,000, right, which in today's money would be almost $200,000. So it's a bit better a deal than the deal that people who wrote Bambi and Dumbo got. We've spoken on that in previous videos. But it doesn't really make up for the fact that by 1986, the film had earned over $300 million, right? So it's a good deal, but it's not really a good deal, right, in the grand scheme of things. So anyway, like we said, he bought the rights to the story in 1938. And then in 1939, this is where he began the developing for the story. So who he got to write the storyboard, yeah, was a certain Dalton Raymond, right? So he was a Southerner, and obviously it's a thing where Disney wanted it to be written by a Southerner. However, it's a thing where he's a white Southerner, and these stories here are about black Southerners, and obviously we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's a thing where obviously how a white Southerner and a black Southerner in those days are going to perceive things is going to be very, very different. And so it was a thing where, to try and balance this out, it was a thing where Disney brought in Clarence Muse. So he was an actor and also he was a scriptwriter. And the idea was basically that there would be a bit more of a balance, yeah, between this kind of white Southerner's view and this black Southerner's view of what the situation would be. But Clarence Muse ended up quitting the project, yeah, because Raymond wouldn't take on board any of his criticisms. And it's a thing where Disney in later years tried to kind of like downplay it and basically say the reason why he left was basically because he was salty because he didn't get the role as Uncle Remus. But that's not probably the case. It's probably more this thing here of being, ignored and stuff, right? Especially when being brought in on this project, yeah, to balance things out. To work on the project didn't start until 1944, and it's a thing where Disney still wanted it to be balanced out, yeah, because just having a Raymond write it, it would still have too much of a white Southern slant. So what he decided to do is to have an actual screenwriter, because I've got to say as well, Raymond had never and would never write another script other than Song of the South. And so they got someone who was A, more kind of experienced, but B, also someone who balanced out the kind of like nature of Raymond, right? So who they got instead was Maurice Rapf. So Maurice Rapf, he was a Northern Jew who also happened to be a communist. So he ended up getting in trouble a bit later on with regard to the whole McCarthy era thing. So the idea was having this Northern Jew and like this Southern white guy, right, writing the script. So the script that Raymond wrote had a lot of racial overtures, right? So the black people saying massa, which means like master, white characters in it referring to darkies. So it's quite explicit, kind of on the nose thing. And also as well, it was a thing where how he kind of wrote it, it still implied that it was kind of an antebellum story, right? So it was a story where it would be set in the time of slavery, right? So the black people would be slaves. So in contrast to this, Rapf wanted it to be very much set in the era of Reconstruction. And he wanted that to be very clearly said, yeah, that kind of like, we're freemen, I ain't got no master, all these kind of things here, yeah, right? So the constant clashing between these two visions end up leading to the Song of the South being very much a compromised film. And the thing is, we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of the themes and history, but the thing is, like, at the time, America was very much divided on this issue of race. So it was very hard to please anyone with this, and so they end up having to have a compromise between the different competing visions. So for instance, the NAACP were very, very annoyed because they didn't end up getting a treatment for the film, which had been denied to them. But then also as well, other people, like especially from the South, were complaining about how the black people were being depicted with the white people in such close proximity during an era of segregation. So lots of politics, lots of kind of like messiness with this, but eventually the script ended up coming out, which was a kind of as good of a compromise as they likely could have made. So talk about the story of the studio, right? So it was a thing where in the early days, what Walt wanted was for the entire film to be animated. However, during this time, like we said before, you had budget cuts because of like the fall in revenue from different films. You also had the war. You also had like the Disney animated strike. All these things was kind of happening. So the film ended up being shelved, for many, many years. And also it was a thing where it was decided that they'd strip back on the amount of the film that was animated. So instead of it being a feature-length film that was going to be animated, instead only a third of the film was going to be animated, and the rest of it would be a live action. So with regard to all of this, this is where like the casting comes in, right? So originally Uncle Remus was going to be played by Paul Robeson. So Paul Robeson, he was a singer, he was an actor, he was involved in many, many different things, and also he was quite a big political activist and stuff, right? And it's a thing where Walt Disney in 1941 met with him and kind of, they discussed the idea for the film stuff. But more likely than not, what ended up happening is because Paul Robeson, again, a communist and stuff, right? His politics probably got in the way of him getting this role. So instead, the person who ended up being picked is someone who had worked with Disney before, but hadn't actually kind of met with him because, like, his role was quite minor. And this was James Baskett. So James Baskett, he had been Fats Crow in Dumbo. So we've covered that in the previous video, talked about Dumbo. But it's the thing where he originally just applied to be one of the talking animals in the thing. He didn't expect to kind of ever get like the lead role. But it was a thing where Walt Disney heard his voice and thought, you know what, he would be perfect as the role as Uncle Remus. So he ended up being picked for that role. Then in terms of the actor who played Johnny, this was Robert Driscoll. So he would later go on to be in Disney's Treasure Island, and also he'd be the voice of Peter Pan in 1953, one of Peter Pan. So we'll talk more about him as an actor in that video, but for now, just know that he was in these two films. And then also you had Ginny, who's played by Luana Patton. She wasn't in any other kind of major films or anything. You had Ruth Warwick, who was in Citizen Kane, and she played Miss Sally. You had Nick Stewart, who played Specs Crow in Dumbo, and he is the voice of Brer Bear. You have Johnny Lee, who is the voice of Brer Rabbit. He's not really anything too notable. And then, of course, you have Hattie McDaniel, and she was very famous in Gone with the Wind. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But yeah, so she was a major character in that. So that explains the kind of like casting of the thing, right? And we talk about the kind of the story of the studio. But now we're going to dive into the themes and the history of the Song of the South. And it obviously gets quite controversial, but yeah, that's what we're going to go into now. So talking about the kind of like notable themes and history of a Song of the South. So obviously the main kind of like theme that they have is one of the story being put in a kind of thing of like fables, right? So a fable is a story which has a moral in it, right? So morals is obviously life lessons within the story. So each of the stories, although obviously, as it says at the beginning, it's talking about critters, right? It's very much like Aesop's fables, where although the things are happening to animals, it's a thing where you as a human being can still get those life lessons. And even though it might be aimed towards children, it still is a thing where it's a universal thing. It's a thing where any adult, any person can get life lessons from this, right? So that's kind of one kind of theme from it. Another theme is kind of friendship, right? But friendship that crosses different societal norms. So if you think about someone like Johnny, for instance, right? At the time, someone like him, who's a white, rich, southern boy, more likely than not, he would never be friends with a girl. He'd never be friends with someone from a lower class. He'd never be friends with a black person. But within the film, quite naturally, he's friends with, Ginny, who's a poor white girl. He's friends with Toby, who's a poor black boy. And also, of course, with Uncle Remus, right? So in many ways, it kind of like crosses a lot of these kind of like boundaries, right? And even at the time when the film came out in 1946, these boundaries were still very much in place. Like kind of boys didn't tend to play with girls. White people, even up until the 1990s, in many places, white people and black people were, they didn't like live together. They didn't tend to interact with each other in any kind of like positive way at all. And yet on screen, you see quite a natural friendship. There's not a kind of like hierarchy of anything. He doesn't try and boss anyone about. It's like a genuine kind of like friendship which is kind of being shown on screen. So it's very progressive, especially for its time. But of course, the big elephant in the room is the theme of race, right? And there's no kind of getting away from it. The fact as well that like, because it, like we said, it was like this kind of compromise between the two things. It's a thing where whichever way you look at it, it was going to annoy people, right? As a matter of fact, it's the thing where one of the publicists for Disney, there's Vern Caldwell. He actually wrote a letter to Percy Pierce, who we discussed in the last video, and he said this, right? Between the Negro haters and the Negro lovers, there are many chances to run afoul. So the point being, like we said, it's a thing where it's the 1940s, right? You've got segregation in the South. It's a thing where black people don't have any voting rights in many places. They're disenfranchised. There's segregation everywhere in the schools, in like public places, everything, right? So with that being the case, it's a thing where you're going to have black people like in like the NAACP who are going to critique the kind of racial stereotypes within this, yeah, of like how the black people are portrayed. On the flip side, you're also going to have a lot of like white Southerners who are going to be like, why are these white and black people like kind of like mixing with each other in this kind of like friendly and like close way and stuff, right? So it's a thing where no matter how the film was going to come out at that time, it's a thing where it was going to be controversial to have these things on screen. However, we have to look at this not through kind of 21st century eyes, as often people do. We have to look at this in terms of 1946 vibes, right? And we have to actually understand that for the time, in spite of the criticism that it was actually very progressive, yeah, for its time. Because people in those days, there weren't that many roles where black people would be portrayed. And so the only times when it was really showed was in the setting of slavery. You see this again with Gone with the Wind, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's a thing where, yeah, it's difficult, but the thing is, it's given what America was at the time, it would have been difficult to have made a film which would have been more progressive than what the Song of the South was. It would, so as much as we wouldn't like it, and as much as people at the time didn't like it, it was a thing of realistically, like this was the best that could have been done at the time. It's very controversial to say that, but yeah. And it's also a thing where because they didn't kind of make it explicit, yeah, that it was in the Reconstruction era, even me today, I filmed this, I did the research for it today. Until today, when I was filming this, I didn't know that it was based in the Reconstruction era. I'd always watched it assuming that they were slaves. So I can't remember what board it was, but like there was a board that was in charge of like film stuff. I'll have it on screen now. But they actually advised that the film at the start of it should say it's set in 1870, because then it'd be clear that it's like post-slavery and stuff. But for whatever reason, this wasn't included. And so you watch the whole film being like, are they slaves? Are they not slaves? It's kind of an open air thing. And that's probably why it got so much criticism, right? Something which had originally meant to be something which was progressive and showed like black people in a positive light, end up being something which was tainted and end up being kind of it's tied in with the kind of like lost cause myth, yeah, which was often believed by a lot of like Southerners, yeah, which was like the idea that slavery was good for the slaves, like slaves and masters like got on with each other. The Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was a war of northern aggression trying to interfere with like the Southern way of life and stuff. And yeah, it's all kind of tied in a very ugly way with that. If you made it clear that it was a Reconstruction era film, it probably would have got less criticism, yeah, because it would have been, but instead, because you're thinking the whole time that it's set in slavery times, you're thinking the master and the slave here are a bit too close to each other and this kind of it's just not good, right? But is a thing where actually people in those days seeing black people on screen in roles where they're likable characters, where they're main characters, again, it's a thing where in a world where most white Americans would never have seen any black people, or any black people that they would have seen, they would have had a like preconceived like notion of them, of what they were like. Having these black characters in films like this at the time, I would argue actually did quite a lot to improve race relations, because it broke down those racial barriers and stuff. Yeah, that's my personal take. If you kind of look enough at the history of it, I think that's kind of the take that people would have for it. For instance, when we're talking now about the kind of legacy of the film, it was very, very popular at the time, right? It did incredibly well at the box office, right? So considering that the film only cost about $2 million to make, and yet at the box office it made $65 million, right? And as we said, like, even by 1986, it had made the equivalent of like 300 million. So it was very popular at the time when it came out. And it's a thing where actually in 1948, it ended up winning 2 Academy Awards. One was for Best Original Song, and this of course is Zippity Doo-Dah. And the second award was an Academy Honorary Award, right? And this was given to James Baskett. So James Baskett, he died in July of 1948, but this award was handed out at the beginning of 1948. And it's a thing where he was the first African-American male who won an Academy Award. This is the Oscars, right? And the first African-American to win an award was the very same Hattie McDaniel, right? So the person who plays Aunt Teppy, she was in Gone with the Wind. That's where she won it there. So again, we can critique these films such as Gone with the Wind. We can critique these films such as Song of the South. But it was actually the first opportunities and the only opportunities where African Americans in those days, within that context of that society, would have got any notoriety and any respect and access, to like being like big shots and stuff, right? So it's an imperfect film, and obviously as well, Disney in more recent years, even before they kind of went like seriously like woke and stuff in the last few years, right? Even from when I was growing up, it was very, very difficult for you to get access to Song of the South. So, Disney really distanced themselves from it because obviously the 1940s in that terms are like so different from the time we're living in now. And so what had been a very progressive film now looks very, very dated, and in some parts looks quite ugly. Although I would argue, like what I said with the video to do with Dumbo, Dumbo is way, way more racist, way more explicitly racist. That we've already discussed that in the Dumbo video. Check that out. But it's a thing where Song of the South, if you watch Song of the South and then you watch Dumbo, you will come away being like, Dumbo is the one that should have been cancelled, not Song of the South. Like it just, Song of the South, like, you watch it and you go, okay, everything's all kind of cool and stuff, like it's a little bit weird and stuff, but it's not. They don't say things like grab that rope, you hairy ape. They don't have the black people like this. They don't. The fact that even they had black actors playing black roles in Song of the South already speaks volumes, because like we said in the Dumbo one, the main crow in that, who was originally called Jim Crow, is voiced by a white guy. So actually it's a thing where everyone kind of completely gives like the Dumbo a bit of a pass, but it's a thing where Song of the South is the one that everyone focused on, right? But anyway, so we kind of spoke about the legacy of the film, we spoke about all the different things, and now we're going to finish it off by looking at any notable lines and notable effects. So in terms of notable lines, there aren't necessarily that many notable lines. It's kind of more like there's funny stories and like kind of just good vibes throughout the whole film and stuff, right? But there are some which we'll kind of talk about, such as,
and just cause these here tales is about critters like Bear Rabbit and Bear Fox, that don't mean they ain't the same like it happened to folks. So them what kids learn from a tale about critters just ain't got their ears tuned for listening.
And also such as this one.
You said this was a laughing place. And if I ain't laughing. I didn't say it was your laughing place. I said it was my laughing place.
And in this one here, Aunt Tempe, she is just an absolute savage in this, like just.
Some folks does the work while others just visit. Sit around whittling and telling stories like Bear Fox and Bear Rabbit. Stick his nose in this here kitchen, and we have Bear Rabbit stew.
I mean, that is, what the hell? That's just, she's absolute savage, like props to Aunt Tempe. She's not mucking about. But anyway, so you got that, and then talk about the notable effects. There aren't really many notable effects yet. Having animation and having like live action on the screen at the same time is actually nothing new. When we discussed our video talked about Walt Disney's biography, as you can see in that, there's a thing where he, you can see Walt Disney himself on screen at the same time as they've got the cartoons. So there's nothing new in that regard, but it's a thing where there was one thing in particular where they had kind of technical issues. This is on the last day of filming, yeah. So on the very last day of filming, there was an issue with regard to the Zippity Doo-Dah scene. So it's obviously the iconic thing. If you've never seen Song of the South, you probably have seen that scene, and it's the one where, you know, initially, you know, it goes from being live action, and then all of a sudden it jumps to it being a cartoon, right? So that there they had a bit of technical difficulties with, yeah. So there was an issue with regard to blocking, right? Now I didn't know what blocking was in the terminology of like film until I kind of like looked into it a bit more. So long story short, for the amateurs just like me, basically it's to do with the position of the character on screen. That's all it is. That's all it is. But in order to resolve the issue, what Walt suggested, yeah, was that basically you'd have a bit of cardboard, yeah, covering up the lights, and you'd have just a thin little strip to basically have like that as the sky, and then suddenly you remove that cardboard, and this is the moment at which it transitions from being live action to being live action with the cartoons. So yeah, so that's talked about like the only real notable kind of like effect that they had in the film. But there we go. That's the end of our video talking about the Song of the South. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that, you know, if you've never seen it before, you actually go and watch it, because it doesn't deserve the kind of like bad press that it gets. Obviously, it's problematic for modern day times, but at the same time, look at it in the context of the time when it was made. Like we've said with all of the films that we're talking about, you have to look at it almost like it's a historic event when you're looking at any kind of film. And within that context of it, I think it's a great film. But next week, we're going to be covering Cinderella, so definitely stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, have a great day and bye.